The Expedition. A story by John Campbell. Read by John Campbell. It's long gone now, the two decaying Victorian houses and the large grand house beside them. Long gone. Once the house had been a grand building, a status symbol of wealth, standing proudly in the shadow of the church. Over time, it had been converted into apartments, and later into flats and bedsits. The wide central staircase, with its elegant banisters, now shabby, and more often than not, echoing to the scrambling and chattering of the children living in the dilapidated quarters above. My best friend, Kenny, was the eldest of those children, 12 years old, taller than my 9-year self by a good head and shoulders. He was a good lad, Kenny, thin of build and worn of face, aware of his lot in life, but resolute in his grasp of it. The garden at the rear of the building is long gone too. The large expanse of bare earth, with a few dotted sycamore trees, enclosed within crumbling Victorian walls, is now a car park. But I remember that garden so well. I remember the sycamore tree too, the wooden platform in its lower part, intended as the base of a tree house, which was never completed. We'd often spend Saturday afternoons on that platform and gaze over the wall at the neighbouring garden. A garden so overgrown with bushes and brambles and trees that nothing could be seen. But we'd heard stories of that garden. It was said that the owner of the adjoining house had been murdered long ago in Victorian times, and because he was rich, he'd been buried in the garden. How we wondered if it were true. Time and again we'd gaze over the wall and ponder, is there really a grave? Is there really a murdered man in that grave? Perhaps there was. Or perhaps the whole story was a work of fiction. Either way, it was our sworn duty to find out. Our expedition began on a warm afternoon, when Kenny, armed with a large stick torn from an unwilling bush, and I, armed with a plastic rapier and wearing a black cardboard Zorro mask that covered my eyes, descended the stone stairway into the basement and entered the garden through the old wooden door. We made our way along the back of the house before turning right into a narrow gap between the building and the wall. Here, Kenny climbed up onto a deep sandstone window ledge at the first window and pulled me up after him. I attempted to peer through the window into the passageway beyond, but the glass was too ingrained with grime to see anything clearly. Using the finger holes created by the degraded mortar, which had crumbled from in between the courses of brickwork, we inched our way along, a window at a time. We continued this painstaking process for some 5 minutes or so, until finally we reached the narrowest point, and with a quick twisting movement, manoeuvred ourselves onto the middle reaches of the boundary wall. There was now a climb of some 4 feet or so, and we covered the distance quickly, pausing only briefly at the top to catch our breaths, before descending down the other side. As we stood proudly on this untrodden territory, I was struck by how quiet and still everything was. no bird song, no buzzing or whirring of insects, no stirring of leaves. The silence was abruptly broken by the whoosh and thwack of Ken's stick as he launched an all-out attack on the thick undergrowth which trespassed to within a few inches from our feet. Chunks of stinging nettles, assorted weeds, and bits of twigs flew to left and right as he cut a jagged swathe in front of us. I attempted to assist his progress with my trusty rapier, but the overall effect was minimal, as I only succeeded in scattering a few dandelion heads. However, it has to be said that, in my opinion, my swishing sound was far more soothing and pleasant on the ear than his unsophisticated thwacking. Our progress through the veritable jungle was painfully slow, due in part to the density of the undergrowth, which in places was impenetrable, but in the main due to the frequent pauses as we reenacted the adventures of Zorro. At length we came to the edge of a small circular clearing, and were able to see another red-bricked wall which marked the boundary. As we drew closer, I could see that this wall was topped with rusted barbed wire, and the brickwork was in a similar state of disrepair to the one we had recently negotiated. More importantly, there was a low, narrow stone shape set into the ground, just a couple of feet from the wall. We approached on tiptoe, and to our sheer astonishment found ourselves looking down at a grave. So it was true, after all. The owner had been murdered, and he was buried in the garden. In truth, I don't think either of us had really expected to find anything, but there we were, looking down at a grave, which meant that the legend was true. I can't remember who spotted the figure first, whether it was Kenny or whether it was me, or whether it was both of us at the same time. What I do remember is the chilling sight of a tall, indistinct figure watching us silently from the shadowy tree line at the eastern edge of the clearing. I also have a clear recollection that as the figure moved towards us, Ken reacted first. "Run!" he yelled, and in a flash he was disappearing headlong back the way we had come. I dashed after him, and when I looked back over my shoulder, I could see the figure following. It moved soundlessly through the trees and undergrowth, apparently making no visible effort to avoid the tangle of brambles that littered its path. Ken was halfway up the wall when I reached the base. I clambered after him, but my progress was slow. It was hampered by the fragments of mortar and brick dust dislodged by his scrambling feet. I remember the sight of his bare legs hanging horizontally at the top of the wall for the briefest of moments, and then he was gone. I climbed for all I was worth, the dread of that figure catching me, pushing me to ever greater efforts. And then Ken's face suddenly reappeared. His hand reached down, took hold of my wrist, and pulled me to safety. As I glanced backwards, I saw the figure standing motionless at the foot of the wall. It may well have been my imagination, but at that moment I could have sworn that I could see the ground and undergrowth in the area that should have been blocked by its body. Ken could see it too. "Run!" he said. "Run!" We scrambled down the other side of the wall as fast as we could, back onto the window ledges, and we made our way back into the garden, ran up the stone steps from the basement into the hallway above, and then I went home, and I hid in my bed. Soon afterwards, we went our separate ways. Kenny and his family moved to one area, and later I and my family moved to another. It was some 15 years before we saw each other again, and it was on a night out. I was with a friend in a nightclub, and who should be sitting at a table but Kenny? Even after all this time he was recognizable, and he clearly recognized me. He came over. We began to chat. We talked of the times when we were children, and then, of course, the subject of the expedition arose. "I went back, you know, the next day," he said. Did you? I never did. Oh, yes. And you know what it was? That thing we thought was a ghost? No, I said. It was a sheet of wallpaper. The wind had blown it in our direction. Oh, said I, a sheet of wallpaper. Now, I don't know about you, but I have trouble accepting that. A, the sheet of wallpaper would have to be at least 6 foot tall. Not impossible. B, it would have to be able to negotiate the trees and bushes. Quite difficult. But C, there was no wind that day. So how could it have followed us?